Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Well, during February 2025 here, I'm digging back into the podcast vault. I've now podcasted since 2017. And for this week's episode, I wanted to pull one from 2021. And 2021 was a year where I read series of books. And one of the series of books I read was the Robert Caro series on Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was a 4-book series. It is one of the most incredible things I've ever read, and it's something I think about a lot. Robert Caro, the author, also wrote another book about a gentleman named Robert Moses of New York City. And so what I did in this podcast episode from September 24th, 2001, is that I compared Lyndon B. Johnson versus Robert Moses. And so this was a fun episode, but I learned a ton from Robert Caro and from these two character studies of these books. So I hope you enjoyed this episode if you missed it the first go round 4 years ago. And so enjoy. Today I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm going to cover two people that I've read about this year. After reading Robert Caro's books about Lyndon B. Johnson and then later about Robert Moses, I thought it'd be fun to take a step back and talk about the similarities and the differences between these two men. The books that I read by Robert Caro about these two people were deep dives into the issue of power. In Robert Moses' case, it was urban power in New York City, and in LBJ's case, it was national power. So I read the 4-book series about LBJ first, then I read Robert Caro's book about his writing style, and that one's called Working. And then after that, I read the book about Robert Moses. I wasn't planning on reading Working or the Robert Moses book, but after reading the LBJ series, I just became absolutely fascinated with Caro and wanted to read more. So as I was reading The Power Broker, which is the one about Robert Moses, I just kept writing over and over in the margin, like LBJ, like LBJ, like LBJ. So I started seeing all these similarities between Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Moses. So this episode will largely be a collection of those instances where I was writing like LBJ in the margins. And I just found it fascinating how similar these men were. And I was wondering how amazing it must have been for Robert Caro to see these common themes in what Caro has spent probably 50 to 60 years of his life at this point with writing about these two men. It must have been amazing for him to see all these similarities. But I think it's also going to show us common ways in which power is obtained, and then common themes dealing with power. Also, I think what this looking into the similarities, what it'll do is help us in our own lives as we come across people who are like this. So I spent 106 days reading these 5 books, the 4 about LBJ and the 1 about Robert Moses. That was 170 hours over those 106 days. So I spent a lot of time reading about these men this year. And I started seeing these common themes and common ideas and even common paths. And what's really fascinating is both of their careers ended in the same year. So their lives didn't mix all that much. I mean, they did meet in their lifetimes, these two men, but their careers ended, both of them ended in the fateful year of 1968. So here it goes. I'll start with the similarities, and then I'll go into the differences, and then I'm going to close out with the one thing that I just cannot get out of my head about these two men. Now back to the episode and to the similarities here first. Well, I think the most important similarity between these two men is just how early you saw in both of their lives who they were. So for example, in LBJ, you see even his neighborhood games. Like if he wasn't winning, he would take the ball. Like he was the kid that brought the ball to the game. And this is poor town, and he was the kid that had the ball. So if he didn't like how the game was going, he would take the ball and leave. And so no one else could play the game after he left. You saw him in high school and in college just doing really demented things to his classmates, to the point where in college, where this is during the Depression, where it is very hard to go to college, to have the money to go to college, people left college so they would not have to be there with LBJ. They left college because they could not stand to be there with this at the same time as LBJ. That is the same man that you saw as president, and there was not a whole lot of change in between that. Robert Moses, he wrote a thesis paper that pretty much outlined what he did for the next 44 years. It was right there in his thesis paper. How many journalists you think went back to LBJ's childhood and learned those stories? How many journalists you think actually read Robert Moses's thesis paper? Not a whole lot, if any. And so it kind of came as a shock later on, like, oh my gosh, LBJ, he's got power. Look what he's doing. And Robert Moses, look at the bad stuff going on here. So then that's the question: does power corrupt and absolute power corrupt absolutely? Is that how this goes? Like once you get power, that's when the things happen. That's when you get corrupted, or was this there from the beginning? And then did this just manifest itself? Did people just finally start to see it once they were on the bigger stage? And that's what Robert Caro says happens here. Robert Caro does not believe in that dictum of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Robert Caro says, no, power reveals. And so what you saw when these men had their absolute power, or as close to absolute power as you can have, what you saw was there from the beginning if you were willing to look. And that has huge ramifications for us. We can look at people who, once they get to levels of power, you say, oh man, we didn't see this coming. But what if you had looked? What if you had read what they had written before? Or you looked at how they voted? You looked at their actions as opposed to what they were actually saying. Could you see some of this stuff coming? That was one of the biggest. I mean, when you write 4 books about one person, and that first book, the majority of it is about LBJ's early life, you see there's not much difference between the 15-year-old LBJ and the 50 and 60-year-old LBJ. That was a really fascinating similarity between these two men. Another was their management styles, how they worked with those under them, and you almost felt like you were reading about the same person when it came to this. So Caro makes the comment about Robert Moses, or somebody that worked for Robert Moses made this comment. He said he worked all of us hard, but he worked harder himself. He worked himself harder. And so you saw that with both LBJ and Robert Moses, that he just demanded so much of those under him. But everyone that worked for him said that Robert Moses and LBJ worked harder than any of them. Both of them would make you feel like you were a part of something big, that they just provided this tremendous sense of purpose. And many of the people, despite the conditions of working for these men, they looked back at it fondly, like a really good and important time of their lives. They felt like they were working for something big by working for LBJ or Robert Moses. And what these men did is they brought out the best of those that worked under them. But they required one thing, and that was absolute loyalty, especially LBJ. LBJ would just, if you were not absolutely loyal, you were out. And so, as you can imagine, some people that worked for both of these men broke under those demands. I mean, to where you had grown men crying, you had men becoming alcoholics just from the pressure of having to work under these men. So their management styles were demanding, yet at the same time, people felt a strong sense of purpose and just delight in what they were doing. There was another similarity is they had both of LBJ and Robert Moses had access to powerful people who became mentors in a way. So for LBJ, 2 really stand out in that were Sam Rayburn and FDR, two men that LBJ looked up to, and that opened a lot of pathways for LBJ. For Robert Moses, he had a friend in Governor Al Smith, and then in LaGuardia later on. And then someone who worked for Al Smith, Belle Moskowitz, she was kind of the brains behind the operation. And it was really fascinating to read about her because she kind of helped Robert Moses go from this idealistic person to more of a pragmatic person. So at the start, he had this idealism going, and he wanted to change things for the good and all that. But Bell really helped him see, like, the idealists don't really make it. It's the people who know how to get things done. They are the ones that make it. And so she helped him along that path. But these access to these powerful people and mentors was a strong similarity in both of their lives. Hiding information. Both of them were masters at this. There's a case in The Power Broker where Moses printed up transcripts of a particular hearing, and he left out all of his damaging admissions from that transcript, but printed all of the other things from that hearing. The most famous one on the LBJ side is the yearbooks. So this was it was either the high school or college yearbooks, and Carroll really talks about this in his book Working, and this was a huge thing for him. This opened up a lot of insight into LBJ, in that Robert Carroll was going back and looking at these yearbooks, and somebody said, "Have you seen the yearbooks?" And Robert Carroll said, "Yeah, I mean, I've got them right here. Look, there's nothing really bad about LBJ." And this person said, "Well, you haven't seen the actual yearbook then." And what had happened was LBJ and some of his friends had removed all of there was a bunch of negative things about LBJ in these yearbooks, and LBJ and his friends had removed them, but they didn't get to all the yearbooks. And so some yearbooks existed with that content still there. And so Robert Carroll did not even realize it when he's looking at these yearbooks that pages had just been ripped out and stuff carefully removed. And so when he saw the full yearbook next to the one where content had been removed, he knew this was something big, because that takes a lot of work, a lot of planning, a lot of tracking down all the yearbooks out there to get that information out of the yearbook. And think about that. I mean, LBJ doesn't know. He wants to be president. He has that ambition since he's young, but at that point he doesn't know that he's going to be president or senator. And so to be pulling that content out of the yearbooks at that time in his life, that's a huge insight into the man. So you see this quite often with both of these men is this desire to hide information that as you look back at their lives, you see how it's hidden and you see the actual what happened, and it offers a lot of insight. Both men also had deep friendships with the media, both LBJ and Robert Moses, not just with the media, but like the heads of the major newspapers. And that was just really interesting to see. I mean, Robert Moses, he would prepare press releases and hand them to the New York Times, and they would basically just reprint them. The New York Times would just reprint what Robert Moses gave them. Quite a bit of influence. Another similarity is their impact on the government. So with LBJ, that's obvious. If you read the third book of the series, Master of the Senate, he became the master of the Senate. And the Senate was not supposed to have a master. It was set up a very particular way so that it would not ever have a master. And yet here comes LBJ, and he is the first person in history to really become a master of the Senate, something that should not have been possible. With Robert Moses, you see this where Robert Carroll points out, we can look at the buildings, we can look at the bridges of what Robert Moses accomplished in New York, but something that's kind of hidden is his achievement in reshaping the machinery of New York's state government. And this was something he did before he did a lot of the building projects. So he wasn't just a master builder. He wasn't just the engineer and the legal genius. He was someone who looked at the government as a whole and looked for ways to make it more efficient. And his work in that had a huge impact in the shaping of the New York government. Both men were completely out of touch with the general populace. Robert Moses actually ran for governor of New York, and he just had such disdain and contempt for the public that it was so obvious that he did not win the vote. Like it was bad. And you just read about all these cringeworthy moments from both of these men, and LBJ too. Like as he's campaigning, he just has a general disdain for the people. I mean, he wants their votes, he needs their votes, but there's just this level of being separated from the people that cringeworthy is the best word I can think of as you're reading about these things. And with both of these men, Robert Moses he kind of billed himself as the non-politician, and yet he had more control and more power than most politicians, including governors and mayors. But yeah, just this kind of contempt for the public. Another similarity is that they both had access to purse strings, and they both had access to money, and they used that money to gain power. And so Robert Caro highlights this quite often in showing how economic power can lead to political power. So for LBJ, one way that he came to power and became noticed was that before he ever had a really good position, he was raising money from Texans and then handing it out to the Democratic candidates. And so they kind of became indebted to him because this was a time where money was scarce, and all of a sudden LBJ just has all this money coming in from people in Texas, from wealthy people in Texas, and it's funneling through LBJ, and so he gets to determine who gets this money for their campaign, and it had a big impact. And so he became the money man, and that led to political power for him. Robert Moses, same thing. As he's getting more and more power, he is able to hand out lucrative construction contracts for the building that is happening all around New York City as well as New York State. And so that comes with a lot of power. You can give one contract to a particular company over another company if maybe you like them more, or maybe they give you something, or you can start, kind of moving the levers there to get things done how you want them because you have access to the money. I mentioned this before where LBJ would take the ball and go home. Both men had this tendency. So LBJ, when he was young, if he didn't like how the game was going, he would take the ball home and go. Robert Moses did the same thing, but also as an adult. And so if somebody didn't do what he wanted, he would kind of throw this tantrum and threaten to quit. And he would even start walking out of the room and no, we can't let him quit because he's doing so many great things for New York. He's doing so many great things for the city. You can't let this man quit. So he would throw these tantrums to get what he wanted, and very childlike behavior. But both men, they did forms of this throughout their lives. Another similarity, both men viewed World War II as an irritating interruption to their plans. And this was both men. The war was just, for their ambition and what they were going for, this really derailed things in multiple ways. Another thing was hospitality. They used hospitality to gain power. So LBJ would have people at his ranch, just live it up with these people, and that was another way that he generated power. Same with Robert Moses. And with hospitality, you can invite people. You can make sure some people are not invited, and that can kind of, who's in the in crowd and who's in the out crowd. It all comes into play, and just another way that both of them used power. Another way is that they both participated in stolen elections. One with Robert Moses was when he was doing something with Jones Beach, and he rigged things to where the election was, it was stolen. And then, of course, the famous one with LBJ, the 1948 Senate race, where he clearly stole that election. That led to him getting to Washington, and he probably wouldn't have been president had he not stolen that election in 1948. Interesting connection point between these two men is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they both knew him. LBJ was quite close to him. Robert Moses had some run-ins with him, but yeah, FDR is kind of a neat connection point between these two men, even though LBJ and Robert Moses didn't meet all that much together. I mean, they did meet, but FDR was kind of a neat connection point between those. final thing I want to highlight in this section is just how much their power generated from working insanely hard. It's kind of fun to think that just random events got these people in power, and that's how it works, is people just get lucky in life and all of a sudden they're in power. But you read what these men did, what went into how they got to where they did. And there were a lot of bad things that went into that, but they also worked extremely hard. And I thought it'd be fun to just highlight some of their working styles, because it's unbelievable how these men worked. So let's start with Robert Moses. He says that Robert Caro says this: his life became an orgy of work. Even so, there was never enough time. Minutes were precious to him. To make sure that he had as many of them as possible, he tried to make use of all those that most other men waste. So listen to this. He had always worked in his car while traveling. Now he turned the big Packard limousine into an office. With Howland sitting beside him on the rear seat, 3 other engineers swiveled around on the jump seats, and 2 other crammed in beside the chauffeur. He held staff meetings in the limousine, while another limousine trailed behind so that when Moses was finished with his men, he could drop them off and they could be driven back to Belmont Lake while he continued on to his destination. Reading a little bit later on, he says, wanting Miss Tappan available, this was his stenographer, wanting her available whenever he needed secretarial assistance, Moses placed at her disposal a car and 3 chauffeurs. So his stenographer had 3 chauffeurs, who worked around the clock in 8-hour shifts. On many mornings, she arrived at his home at 7:30 a.m., her car pulling up behind that of Howland, who was picking up Moses' night-written memos, and she would get into Moses' limousine so that he could start dictating the minute he stepped in. As she drove with him, her car followed behind so that whenever he was finished with her, she could get out of his car, step into her own, and speed back to Belmont Lake or 302 Broadway to parcel out the work among the subordinate secretaries, while he, chauffeured by one of his 3 chauffeurs, continued on to his destination. Lunches were a constant source of irritation to Moses. He hated to interrupt his work for them. Now he began refusing invitations to lunch. Anyone who wanted to dine with him came to his office, and a secretary would run out for sandwiches. Now let's learn about his phone calls. Finally, he had a new telephone setup installed. Under it, there were many lines into his secretary's office, but only one from hers into his, on the single telephone that remained on his desk, where there were no buttons. If he was talking on that telephone, all other callers, with the single exception of Governor Smith, for whom all other calls were dropped, had to wait until he was finished. He was very pleased with this stratagem, and he used it for the rest of his life. The 5 governors who succeeded Smith and the 5 mayors of New York City for whom Moses would work had to get used to being told that Mr. Moses would have to call them back. He could not talk at the moment because his line was tied up. End quote. That limousine thing is just unbelievable. So he's in a limousine. He's dictating everything to the people in that limousine. When he's done, they'll just pull over to the side so that they can get out, get into their own limousine. He continues on to where he's going. They go back and they get all the instructions back to all of his other employees. His stenographer, his head secretary, has her own vehicle, has her own crew of 3 chauffeurs. Robert Moses has his own crew of 3 chauffeurs, and he's just switching cars to be able to do different meetings as he's going to destinations that he's going to. He just did not waste a single minute of any day. And yes, that is crazy, but he got so much done in his life, and that's just it just blew me away to read about that working style. I want to read one other thing about Robert Moses's style, and I'm gonna read a short section here. But you give a problem to Moses, and overnight he's back in front of you with a solution, all worked out, down to the last detail, drafts of speeches you can give to explain it to the public, drafts of press releases for the newspapers, drafts of the state laws you'll need to get passed, advice as to who should introduce the bills in the legislature and what committees they should go to, drafts of any city council and board of estimate resolutions you'll need. If there are constitutional questions involved, a list of the relevant precedents, and a complete method of financing it all spelled out. He had solutions when no one else had solutions. End quote. So this is the key thing. This is the thing I highlighted in that episode about the power broker that stood out to me the most, is that when Robert Moses pitched a job, he had everything ready. And I mean everything. And so what are you going to do as the mayor if you have to make a decision between a number of projects? And Robert Moses had everything spelled out for you. He's got the financing ready. He can get started. He's got the machinery ready. He'll start digging tomorrow morning if you okay it. Everyone else that's coming to you is just giving you blueprints. They haven't gone through the legal precedent. They don't know if it is actually possible, if they can get it approved. And they certainly do not have people ready to start digging the next morning. Who are you going to choose? And I loved that about Robert Moses, because he was so well prepared. He had thought through everything, and that ensured that he would get the job. Now, LBJ, the thing that was really impressive about his working style, and again, they both had very similar styles, but let me read a small section about LBJ's style here. For Lyndon Johnson, the mystique of the mail went beyond the political. He had always done every job as if his life depended on it, believing that if you did just absolutely everything you could do, you would succeed. And he tried to perform perfectly every minor task that no one else bothered with. Doing everything one could do with the mail meant answering every letter, and that was what he insisted his office must do. And not only must every letter be answered, he told Latimer and Jones it must be answered the very day it arrived. There was no escape from the mail. Small bundles meant not less but more work for the two young men. It was important to get mail, Gene Latimer explains. That was the most important thing. You had to have people writing you. So if the mail got light, we had to generate mail. Any day that we didn't get 100 letters was a terrible day, and we had to do something about it. Letters were solicited by scanning the weekly newspapers more closely than ever for any conceivable good or bad news that might justify a message of congratulations or condolence, a message in which the congressman would solicit a reply by asking, in Latimer's words, "How am I doing in Washington? What government programs would you like to see passed?" That kind of question. After typing came the retyping. No letter was going out of the office unless it was perfect, Johnson said, and to ensure perfection, he read every single one. And if he didn't like a letter, Latimer said, he would just make a huge angry slash marks across it. No explanation would be vouchsafed. You had to figure out what was wrong. He wouldn't tell you. A single error in spelling or punctuation, and the letter was slashed. He had no compunction at all about making you write them over, even if you had to stay past midnight, Jones says. You handed him 50, 60 letters, and he might mark out every one of them, end quote. So that Lyndon Johnson, the first role he gets, he's working for a senator, and what he does is he answers the senator's mail. This particular senator he loved the game of golf, and he spent a lot of time golfing instead of answering his constituents' letters. And so LBJ comes in as his assistant, and he starts answering those letters. And you see this throughout LBJ's career. He would do things like that, and oftentimes it related to the mail and answering that mail. And the level of detail that went into that, but it was a deep sign of respect. Your constituents are writing to you. They have problems. They have needs. This helped LBJ know what his constituents needed, what their problems were, and it gave him deep insight that other people missed just because they didn't even consider it. And LBJ took it to the extreme. I mean, he had two people working with him, just working across the clock to answer these letters, something that a lot of people thought was below them. He took it to the end. These men, LBJ and Robert Moses, worked so hard that they both worked themselves into the hospital. They worked themselves into exhaustion. They worked themselves into health problems. with LBJ even having a heart attack. So maybe it's not laudable, the intensity of the work, but the way they approached it, there's a lot to learn, and it was interesting just to see how similar their approaches were and how those working under them viewed the men that they worked for. So now let's go into a few of the differences. Well, for their childhoods, their childhoods were quite different. LBJ, for a time, was in good standing. His father was a politician and very well respected, but then his father made a poor decision in business and bought a farm on land that was not good land, and they went bankrupt and were in debt for the rest of their lives, to where they became the laughingstock of their small town. This is small town Texas in the hill country of Texas. That was not a pleasant thing to be in poverty, to have family members have to bring you food because your family is so poor, and to have done that in a very public way in a small town led to tremendous humiliation in something that LBJ always tried to disassociate himself from, especially disassociate himself from his father, but to disassociate himself from that painful past. Robert Moses, on the other hand, grew up in privilege. He grew up quite wealthy and with a pretty haughty attitude. And he got it from his mother. And so when I look at these two men's lives and the differences in how they grew up, what's interesting is that what LBJ became would have horrified his parents. His parents were the idealists, and since they had that fall from grace, LBJ's lesson was that idealism is bad. You have to be pragmatic. You just have to get things done. And so the idealist is actually dangerous. You need to have the pragmatist. And so LBJ viewed himself as the pragmatist who could get things done. And his father was also honest. And so LBJ looked at that honesty, and he looked at his mother's idealism and love of literature and books, and he looked at that and denounced it. He did not want that. And so he took the exact opposite lesson what his parents would have wanted. But when you look at Robert Moses, his mom would have been proud. He acted like his mom did, and there wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been a shock for him. That would not have horrified his mother, because that's how his mother was, kind of this haughty attitude, this I'm better than the rest of mankind attitude. And Robert Moses had that throughout his life. Another difference was in their use of law. And this is kind of a slight difference, but LBJ, his purpose was to write things. He made the comment he wants to write things in the book of law. And so that what he was talking about in that statement was about civil rights. He wanted to get it written in the books of law so that it would be from that point forward. And so in a way, LBJ had, I guess, a good desire of getting something in the books of law that would positively impact things going forward. Robert Moses, on the other hand, he was a master of the law, but he was a master of the law and of contracts for his own benefit. And so he knew how to hide something in a contract or hide something in a law that would give him more power. And people had no idea it was happening because they just wouldn't go into the fine print. And even if they had, he just worded things in a way that you could easily gloss over it and completely miss it, but it would allow Robert Moses to consolidate his power. And he did this time and time again, and would just kind of humiliate people because they would come in and say, "Hey, you can't do this. Who do you think you are? What are you doing?" And he would point to the law that they had helped promote or had signed, and he would say, "Oh, you were part of who gave me this power." And so Robert Moses was just a master in that sense. And so their use of law was different in the sense of LBJ was kind of using it to put good things forward, whereas Robert Moses was using it to consolidate his own power. In the issue of quid pro quo, there were some differences in the sense that for Robert Moses, it was about being on his team or not being on his team. And so there were quid pro quos of you, I do this for you, you do that for me, but it was never, you could never pin it on Robert Moses. It was all kind of underhand. It was behind the scenes. And so it wasn't this easy quid pro quo. Whereas for LBJ, it really was on in a lot of cases where he would make it quite clear, I've done this for you, you are going to do this for me. And then you always see LBJ especially on the Senate floor, he'd be in people's ears whispering, and he was reminding them of things, or he was getting his way, but he was just kind of working the room and whispering and doing these quid pro quos constantly. And we don't even know the majority of these quid pro quos because it was just him whispering in someone else's ear. Last difference I want to highlight is in the path to power in the sense of this. For Robert Moses, it really did start with an idealism, and it quickly went to a pragmatism. And so he wanted power for good's sake. He thought that if he had power, he could do good things. And the brilliance of Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, about Robert Caro, and the subtitle, about Robert Moses, the subtitle, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, is that you see something is seriously off, even in that subtitle, before you even start the book. You think, okay, Robert Moses, master builder, he built all these things that I know in New York City. How could this be bad? And yet you see what went behind it. And even this desire for power for good's sake, or this starting with idealism, it can quickly go the wrong direction. For LBJ, what's interesting is with that childhood poverty and humiliation, he never really had that idealism. He may have slightly had it at the very beginning before all that, but it was long gone, and he was a man of pragmatism and ambition. And ambition ruled his moral compass. And so you don't start with LBJ with this idealism. You start with LBJ with ambition. And then that ambition moved to pragmatism. Whereas Robert Moses, it started with idealism and then went to pragmatism, just getting things done. With LBJ, it started with ambition and then went to pragmatism. Whereas with Robert Moses, he wanted power for good's sake, to do good things. LBJ wanted power for power's sake. He just wanted power to further his ambition. Now into the final segment, and my one thing that I just cannot get out of my mind about these two men. And it can be best summed up in this statement. Both men did what principled men were unable to do. Both men did what principled men were unable to do. In the back of one of the books about LBJ, I wrote a statement, a question of just wondering what LBJ could have done with proper motives. With it not being about his ambition and furthering his ambition, what if he had taken that just insane work ethic? What if he had taken this? You do see times where he helps people tremendously in his life. What if all that had the proper motives, as opposed to being about furthering his ambition of someday reaching the presidency? But if you go down that route, you realize he would have never become president with the proper motives. He got to where he was through deception. He got through to where he was through a blatantly stolen election. That was just one thing. He got to where he finally got to the presidency in ways that he wouldn't have if he had done things in a proper manner, in a principled manner. And so what do you do with that? And that's one of the big questions that Carol raises in these books. You have a Lyndon Johnson who passed the civil rights bills. He did it as a Southern legislator who for most of his life had voted 100% against civil rights. You have Robert Moses, who you can look at New York City, you can see his fingerprint on the city. You can see his impact. And yet he did things to get to that position. He held near absolute power for 44 years. And so if he hadn't have had that, you wouldn't have all these buildings. You wouldn't have the UN Center. You wouldn't have Jones Beach. You wouldn't have all these things. But the question is, would it have been worth it? And what if these men had never lived? So the question is blatant about Robert Moses and the power broker. Caro asks, what if Robert Moses had never lived? What would New York be like? And it's an interesting question, and it's hypothetical because you can't take that back. But what if he had never lived? What would New York look like now? We can also ask that question about LBJ. What if he had never lived? What if during his time in World War II, where I highlighted that in the episode, but he almost got into a plane that ended up crashing. What if he had crashed during World War II and it had not come back and become a senator and later vice president and later president? What if? Would civil rights have eventually passed? Would LBJ, or would a different vice president for JFK, would they have kept the country together amidst an assassination? We'll never know, but it leads to this question of means versus ends. And gosh, that is such an important question, and I just see it everywhere, especially this year. I mean, I think that's kind of the theme of the year for me, and it came up over and over in these Robert Caro books, but I'm seeing it all over the place. Podcasts I listen to about pastors, or you see it about politicians. Is it okay to have a politician who has done bad things, is doing bad things, but he is getting things passed that you like? That could be a politician in the past. It could be a politician right now. Is that okay? If the direction is bad, can the outcome even be good? And these are really important questions to ask. And I think what you see in the lives of these two men is that it's not worth it. You cannot, if you have this idea of, we're going to do this good end, but the direction we take to get there, the things we do to get there, the way in which we do that is unprincipled. It is wrong. It is stealing election. It is deceitful. It is lying to get to what we want. Can the outcome ever be good? Can bad means lead to a good end? And what you see in these books, is that it's a nuanced question, but you see the devastation along the way for this supposedly good outcome. But is that outcome even good? Are all these buildings and the roads that Robert Moses built, are these even good? And he had to do all this evil to get to these things. Is that even good? Could it even be good at the end? So key takeaways from these series of books: you have to consider someone's entire life. Things show up early, and most people miss this. Power reveals. It does not corrupt. It may corrupt. You may get the person that finally gets power and they go nuts. But usually you can see this stuff early on. And what power does actually is to reveal. Don't look at what those in power say. Look at what they've done. It's just amazing to read through lives like this and to go so in depth and to see how everything they said was some part of the truth, or just most of the time just a straight lie to get what they wanted. Yet if you had looked at what they had done, you would have learned more about those people. So if it's a politician, what did they vote on? How did they vote? What were they like in high school and college? And yes, people can change, and yes, they can be redeemed, but what they were like, what they voted, how they voted, That sort of thing is going to matter, and it should matter more than what they say they will do or what they say they're doing. These two men were unbelievably powerful in their time, and what's startling is we hardly remember them now. That's a bold statement in the sense we all know LBJ. We've heard his name. We know Lyndon B. Johnson. I had actually never heard of Robert Moses until reading these books. And with LBJ, I mean, if I think back to school and we talk about civil rights and we're learning about civil rights, we did not learn about civil rights through LBJ. We learned about it through Martin Luther King Jr. and through other people. It was not tied to LBJ. And I want to read, this is one of the most powerful parts of these books, and it comes from Master of the Senate, the third book, the Pulitzer Prize winner about LBJ. And here's the quote. "No one was going to remember the name of any of those men on the Senate floor," he wrote. "I will read to our children the names of every child born in Georgia in the last 40 years, and I will tell you now that they will recognize only the names of Ralph Ellison and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron. They will not know Harry Byrd. Who did Mississippi put out lately that William Faulkner could talk to, except Richard Wright? It is people like these who are the legislators of mankind. They are more to the point than any senator can be. Our children's children's children will remember poets," he wrote. "They are unlikely to remember Lyndon Johnson." End quote. I love that. These people are the legislators of mankind, the Ralph Ellisons, the William Faulkners, the Martin Luther King Juniors. These are the men that and women that were pushing things forward. It was not LBJ. Someone would have eventually done it on the legal side of things, but the people that really moved things forward, the legislators of mankind, were those people impacting culture. And so what if LBJ had never lived? What if Robert Moses had never lived? What if these men, using evil means to get what they wanted accomplished, whether it was for themselves or for some good idea they thought was good, is that the way to do it, or is there another way? And that is the thing that keeps coming back. Both men did what principled men were unable to do. All right, and back to 2025, Eric here. Thank you for listening to this episode. I wanted to let you know about a book reading group that I'm doing this year. I'm doing it both in person if you live in the Nashville area, but also online. And so it's one book a month. I'm calling it the Short Great Books Reading Group. And to join, all you have to do is subscribe on my Substack. And I have plans for as little as $5 per month. And the idea here is just that I'm choosing books that take between 2 and 5 hours to read. So it's not a huge time commitment. But then we get together in over 2 hours, we talk about these books. So it's a good way to get introduced to some of these classics. The book for March is Aeschylus and his tragedy play Agamemnon. So if you've never read a Greek tragedy, this would be a good place to start. And then after that, we've got books like The Great Gatsby. In December, we're doing A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I've got Man's Search for Meaning in there somewhere. And so I'll have in the show notes a link to the list of books and then how you can join. But I hope you consider that, and we're having a lot of fun so far just with these book discussions. So thanks for listening. I'll be back next week, either with a book for this year or one more episode of Going Into the Vault like this. Until then, keep listening, keep reading, and keep thinking. I'm out.